One of the ideas that I've spent a lot of time thinking and writing about is meritocracy. And meritocracy is roughly the idea that people's outcomes in life, especially when we're talking about education and career, their outcomes should be deserved, right? And you deserve your outcome on the basis of ability, hard work, contribution to society. That's sort of what merit is. So people who work hard and do great things should have wealth and occupy positions of status, and bad or lazy people should not, right? And this is a really common, intuitive, and attractive idea for a lot of people. I mean, it's practically codified in statements of the American dream. Typical statements of that go something like this. If you work hard and play by the rules, then, I don't know, some middle-class life, you'll have some kind of comfortable life. But if you don't work hard or play by the rules, then no guarantees, right? It's the land of opportunity, not the land of everyone gets to live a good life. So there's a lot of different things I could say about meritocracy, and I probably will have more to say about it in future videos. But in this one, I want to talk about something that I think is an underappreciated element of meritocracy, which is that I think it's inherently unstable, self-undermining even. In other words, even if you manage to attain a true meritocracy, it has internal forces which would quickly turn it into something else, and indeed something maybe not unfamiliar to us. So let's start by imagining what a true meritocracy would be like. So this is a world where the jobs people have and the money that comes with them are exactly what they deserve. Everyone's getting what they deserve. And let's suppose, as is typical, what you deserve is based on how much you contribute to society through your work. There's different views on this. Like, there's 1,000 complications I'm going to be glossing over because I want to keep this a relatively short YouTube video. Always bear that in mind. That's just how it is. And it's important to note that I'm including status in here too, right? So I'm thinking of meritocracy not just as a sort of distributive scheme of how to distribute jobs and money, but also as a cultural phenomenon, which is very familiar to us, right? Like modern Western culture and beyond, sort of, there's this meritocratic component that we're all familiar with. So let me clarify a couple of things. First off, we don't live in a true meritocracy. No one lives in a true meritocracy. I'll focus on the American case as usual because that's what I'm most familiar with. America's not a meritocracy, not even close. However, there is still this prevailing view that it is meritocratic and that it should be one, right? So there's this vague belief that it is meritocratic, and often there's criticisms that it's not meritocratic enough. So we have both of these elements that it is meritocratic and it should be more meritocratic or something like that. So what this means is that, right, for anyone who has a lot of money, there's a kind of default presupposition that they deserve it. In other words, that's kind of the belief that, well, it is more or less meritocratic. And since they deserve it, they must therefore be really great, because how else could they deserve so much money, right? We hold them in high regard, right? And this is kind of the status component. Now, there are some exceptions, right, when the very wealthy behave very badly. But by and large, the wealthy take on a kind of celebrity status. They're very important, right? This is a term that we use. They're important people, certainly more important than you or I. And often there's even a default supposition that they must be also really smart or even geniuses. You get that very often. And so we have to pay attention to what they say, even when they say completely asinine things and they're speaking on subjects that they have absolutely no expertise in. This is one of the benefits of having high status and being wealthy. Everyone has to take you seriously no matter what you say. It's fun. So this is what it means for there to be meritocratic status hierarchies. There's a certain respect and deference that goes with having wealth or certain kinds of meritocratic success. And the reason why, thinking of them as really great or smart makes sense, if you have like an aristocracy, for example, and your status is just a matter of luck, you won't assume that they're smart because there's no presumption that there was this meritocratic competition that these people won. Well, in a culture that takes itself to be meritocratic, you do have that, right? So this is why it's natural to regard the very quote unquote successful as being therefore very smart. Now, on the flip side, the unsuccessful are looked down upon and looked at with disdain or contempt, right? You can see this pretty obviously with people's attitudes towards the poor and unemployment. And I actually think a really nice illustration is when you listen to parents talking about their children's careers. Usually parents at the time of when their children are going to college, they'll have a lot to say about, what major they should pursue and what they should be doing with their life and so on. And we all know to have to clean toilets or flip burgers for your career, it's not just bad because you won't make much money probably, but it's kind of shameful, right? This embarrassing, right? It's a different kind of element. It's not work that's respected. All right. Parents want their kids to be lawyers, doctors, engineer. They're going after the respectable things, the things that can confer this kind of social status. It's actually funny, right? One thing that's rare to hear, you do hear it sometimes when parents are talking about their college-age children. You don't usually hear, well, I just want them to live a happy, fulfilling life. You don't usually get that. Because that doesn't really garner respect, right? That's not the source of social status. Anyways, so let's get back to imagining what a real meritocracy would be like. So you have this kind of meritocratic culture. But the other thing that meritocracy requires is some kind of robust equality of opportunity. Why? Well, basically, when someone gets something because of luck, we tend not to say they deserve it. Like if you just win the lottery tomorrow, you make a lot of money all of a sudden, no one's going to say you deserve it. You just got lucky. So in the context of meritocracy, this has really serious ramifications for things like education and all aspects of childhood, right? Because the idea is that the only things that should matter are your ability and your work ethic, right? Those are the things that are merit. Everything else is luck. Really, the underlying idea is, right, a meritocracy is a kind of a competition. And in order for people to deserve their outcomes in a competition, it has to be fair competition, right? And so the thought is, if you have major advantages because your family is wealthy or major disadvantages because you live in a poor neighborhood, well, then the competition to accumulate merit and get the good jobs, etc., isn't fair. No one gets what they deserve. So you need this idea of equality of opportunity. This is a statement that's very close to one from the philosopher John Rawls. And it just basically says, the only things that should matter are your ability and work ethic. So two people of equal ability and work ethic, they should have the same chances for success in occupying various social roles. And this is where the idea of a level playing field comes from, right? It's a sort of inherently competitive idea. And the thought is, again, if it's not fair, if the playing field is not fair, then who can say that anyone deserves what they get here? Now you might ask, wait a minute, isn't at least ability partly dependent on something like natural talent? And isn't that a matter of luck? Yeah, I mean, that's a complication. There are ways of trying to get around this. I don't know that I've seen any particularly persuasive ones, but most of the time people just kind of ignore this and move on. So I will too, because it's not really important for the main point, but it is a perfectly fair question. Now, I do want to sort of make a brief aside here and note that equality of opportunity was something that both Democrats and Republicans agreed on, and they would argue about it as recently as the 2010s. Democrats roughly would sort of argue that various welfare programs would be needed to counteract some of the disadvantages of poverty. And Republicans would claim that that was focusing on equality of outcome, not equality of opportunity, because the idea is that welfare programs give money to the parents of children, and poor parents already lost in the meritocratic competition, right? So we shouldn't try to raise them up. We're just trying to give the kid an equal chance. So they would focus on sort of smaller reforms aimed at the educational system itself in the hopes of, or at least they would say, the hopes of trying to equalize the playing field, if you will. Now, to be honest, both of those positions badly understate the problem. Like if you want to depress yourself, spend a little time looking at the research on educational outcome on the basis of family wealth. It's pretty stark and overwhelming. Children of poor families are at a massive disadvantage compared to their wealthier peers, and for all sorts of reasons. It's not just the quality of the school or how much money, how much funding schools get. That's a part of it, arguably a small part of it. It's the quality of the neighborhood, how enriching the home is, whether the parents have time and money to spend on extracurricular opportunities, how stressful the home and neighborhood is, environmental factors, health factors. There's all of these different things that kind of lead to really significant disadvantages for children that come from poor families. So if you were really serious about equality of opportunity, I think you're basically talking about the elimination of poverty, at least serious poverty, or at minimum getting rid of childhood poverty, right? Those are just incompatible with equality of opportunity, but I digress. So let's imagine that our meritocracy that we're considering has that. It has equality of opportunity. This, of course, will likely require some progressive tax scheme to fund these equality of opportunity measures. So what is the problem? Why am I saying that this is an unstable arrangement? I think to a lot of people, what I'm describing is something like the ideal society, because again, like the commitment to meritocracy is so baked into our culture that this is largely how people think of justice and progress in terms of how well are we approximating this meritocratic ideal. One source of instability is just the existence of significant economic inequalities. There's a lot of empirical research on this at this point. I won't go through it. It's pretty overwhelming. I mean, even the kind of like fancy pants economists who, go to elite conferences and stuff that all over the world, like everyone agrees that economic inequality right now is a serious problem and a source of instability. But anyways, that's sort of, I don't want to say it's obvious. It's important. It's well known. I want to focus on a sort of more, to me, a more interesting sort of cultural phenomenon that is a source of instability. But that is a major source of instability for sure. So the other reason that meritocracy is unstable has to do with the existence of status hierarchies that I talked about. So the problem is basically that when people occupy positions of elevated status, which means that there's, a social expectation that people show them extra deference, extra regard, and so on, they kind of start to believe that they're better than everyone else, to put it simply, right? Michael Sandel, in his book, The Tyranny of Merit, refers to this as meritocratic hubris, as part of one of the things that meritocracy does. Actually, there's a funny statement of this sort of similar phenomenon from Mary Wollstonecraft in her famous 1792 work, Vindication of the Rights of Women, where she's talking about royalty. And she argues that they're basically screwed. People who are in positions of power are screwed. They can't possibly live good, valuable lives because, in her view, a good life is one that where you aim at virtue, cultivating virtue and reason. And how the hell can you do that if you're in a position of power and you're surrounded by people who just tell you how great you are all the time? You're screwed. And this is her point. It's the same kind of idea. I think it's really funny that she makes that point. So my favorite observation of this kind, though, comes from looking at non-hierarchical, egalitarian, really anarchist hunter-gatherer groups. There's many, many, many of these. There's fewer today than there were, of course, but they're really interesting to look at because they often have cultures which are sort of, in some ways, the complete opposite of ours, as I'll illustrate to you in a second. And they clearly see the kind of danger that I'm talking about here. So there's this great quote from an elder of the Kung group. I don't know that I'm saying that correctly, who are a sub-Saharan egalitarian hunting and foraging group. The anthropological work I'm citing is done in the 70s by Richard Borshay Lee, I think 1979. And it's a perfect illustration of what I'm talking about. They have this anti-meritocratic practice that a lot of us would consider shocking or unfair even. I can only imagine what parents would say. Well, let me get to the example first. Basically, when someone, usually a young man, gets a really great kill from hunting, which is very valuable for the group, right? If someone does a really good job hunting, They don't praise him. In fact, they mock him and the kill. And they'll do things like they'll complain that it's too small. Why are you wasting my time bringing me out here to carry this small thing back? Like, why even do this? This is embarrassing. So why would they do this? That is the question. And there's just a wonderful quote from one of the elders on this point. And here's what he says. When a young man kills much meat, he comes to think of himself as a chief or a big man, and he thinks of the rest of us as his servants or his inferiors. We can't accept this. We refuse one who boasts, for someday his pride will make him kill somebody. So we always speak of his meat as worthless. In this way, we cool his heart and make him gentle. So in other words, there's this recognition that if you praise someone too much, if you hold them up too much, you keep holding them in higher regard, it's going to go to their head. They're going to start to believe it. And once that happens, they'll start to demand special treatment and start to think of themselves as being better than everyone else. And once they do that, just about any treatment will be justified from their point of view. It sort of almost turns them into a kind of a narcissist, right? And actually, I'm not going to cite it here, but there is a good amount of empirical research on how getting wealth, status, and power does something like causing brain damage to you. And it's sort of, even if you don't want to call it that, like this is one of the processes that's sort of fairly well understood. And it's quite dangerous, I think. In my, meager amount of research on egalitarian societies, which again, I will just note that there are many, many throughout human history, despite what, normal history would have you think. These kinds of practices are really quite common. These cultural, social practices aimed at preventing people from becoming too full of themselves. They're really kind of typical, and often they're really creative. And in fact, I think to the extent that they insist on economic equality, which they don't always do that sort of completely, but to the extent that they want to minimize significant economic inequalities, it's for the same reason, because once you allow someone to accumulate much more than other people, it's hard for them not to start thinking that they are better than everyone else. And this has really significant social consequences. So let's get back to our meritocracy. Why does all of this suggest that meritocracy is unstable? Well, it's a similar phenomenon, but actually it's a little bit worse in a meritocracy. Yes, the winners of the meritocracy, the meritocratic elites, will likely be full of themselves and think that they're better than everyone else. But unlike in the egalitarian societies where that's going to piss people off, in a meritocracy, we're all ready to elevate them too. We're more than happy to hold them in higher regard. This is just the meritocratic ethos. They are great. We might even aspire, oh man, if only we could be as great as them. Right? That's incredibly typical. So then when the meritocratic elites demand more than what they actually deserve, because they're going to be like, well, why? I'm even greater than what people are allowing me to have. I should have even more than that. Everyone will have a hard time resisting their request. And they might ask, well, wait, isn't taxing them more punishing their success? Sound familiar? Isn't that wrong? And why should money go to the meritocratic losers? They're despicable and contemptible. They should suffer or be punished, right? If anything, why should we help them, right? Again, I hope that sounds familiar. I'm suggesting that kind of dynamic can be traced to these features of a meritocratic culture. I mean, it kind of seems this way. Once you start to elevate someone or some group above everybody else, it's hard, not to see them mattering as more than everyone else, and as their concerns as mattering more, and you start to see the world through their eyes and interests. So the idea that you're punishing their success, for example, by taxing them you're like, yeah, that does make a lot of sense. Now at this point, right, the elites demand more than they deserve, so meritocracy being undermined, and furthermore, good luck funding equality of opportunity, because that's going to probably require pretty significant progressive taxing. And at that point, meritocracy will have morphed into something else, something which is vaguely reminiscent of neoliberalism, in fact, right? Where elites dominate economically and politically, and their dominance is difficult to question or challenge. After all, they must be really great to get where they are, right? How can we criticize them? These are our very best, right? All of these ideas about the greatness of the elites makes it hard to even question that. Anyways, and so once you've lost equality of opportunity, you've lost meritocracy. So I hope you found that interesting and informative. There's some really interesting dynamics, cultural dynamics involved in meritocracy that people are kind of starting to talk about more. And I think it's particularly interesting to look at these dynamics in the context of very different non-meritocratic egalitarian cultures, because they kind of point to the same kinds of social dynamics that pop up all over the place in all human groups and societies. And then the question is, what do you do with it? Anyways, I'll probably have more to say about meritocracy in the future, but that's enough for now.